I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Isabelle Bartkowiak-Théron, and I hope I've got that right. Dr. Isa, I think is how you prefer to be referred. You are dialing in all the way from Tasmania, where my cousin actually lives. He says I must come and work with him in policing out there sometime. I think it might be 8:30 at night. Is that right? It's in the evening.
It is 9 p.m. Yes.
9 p.m. Well, you're looking wonderful after a hard day's work. So Dr. is an award-winning educationalist, and she's now going to lead a discussion on whether the debate and polarization of the debate between the vulnerability of the people we deal with and the resilience of policing is actually doing us more harm than good. So Dr. Isa, over to you, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to contribute to the conference this year. It is customary in Australia to do a little bit of an acknowledgement of country before we talk. So if you wouldn't mind my saying so, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which from which I'm presenting today, and pay my respect to the Muanina people and their elders past, present and future. Now, in saying this, I think it is cautious of me to say that I'm going to bring to the discussion a bit of an Australian perspective on the talk, and that I would really like to have feedback from you all in the UK about what I'm going to say. And what essentially I'm going to reflect on today is on the situation where for the past few years, probably the last 10 years, we've had an extraordinary number of talks, discussions, workshops, publications and research on the theme of resilience and vulnerability in policing, particularly on the topic of vulnerability. And what I want to do today is discuss what has been presented in a number of fora as the resilience of police officers amongst the broader group of first responders, as well as more modestly their vulnerability in their job. Now, whilst I'm saying that, there have been similar discussions around the vulnerability of the various groups in our communities that are being policed, as well as very cautiously their resilience. So there's been a dichotomy here. We talk about the resilience of police officers, but the weakness of the public, and we don't talk about the resilience of the police, and we don't talk of the resilience of the public, and we don't talk about the vulnerability of police officers until very recently. So I'm going to talk about this dichotomy and this binary discourse. But what I'm going to argue is that it's actually quite counterproductive in both policy and practice, and that it is creating a disservice to the policing profession. And I don't think it serves our police officers really well in this. So the three main points that I want to... Jackie, do you want me to share my... Yeah.
Can you take control? I don't think you've done that yet.
Sure.
And then it's all...
Do you want me to share my, there you go. I'll share my slide if you'd like instead. There you go. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can. Thank you. Yes.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So the main three takeaways that I'd like to bring to the discussion today is that what I really am convinced of, and I'm quite happy to have a discussion with you all this afternoon, sorry, is that minimalist discussions of vulnerability, first of all, of ill-informed, and I might actually add erroneous. I would like to say that representations of police resilience are ill-advised, and we're getting more and more evidence of that. And that the current discourse around vulnerability and the current definitions that we have around vulnerability and resilience are doing a really dangerous disservice to the policing profession. So I've just got that slide here to sum up the discourse as or the definitions as we've got it currently. Essentially, we define vulnerability in either two kinds of way. The minimalist approach, as I will present it, is essentially a tick in the box approach. It consists of lists of vulnerability attributes which essentially follow the social determinants of health that Sir Michael Marmot has just presented to us. Are you homeless? Do you use drugs? Are you consuming a certain amount of alcohol? Do you have a record? Do you have employment? Do you have housing? And all those kinds of things. Those lists of attributes are very prescriptive, and they very rarely consider that those vulnerabilities can overlap, can be progressive, can be transient, can be incremental as well, except in the area of mental health, where there are a lot of talks around comorbidity and multiple morbidities and all those kinds of things. But they are also very siloed and often policy-based considerations of those vulnerabilities, so very top-down, very rarely considered ground-up. The other way to look at vulnerability, and this is the context in which myself and my colleague Nicola Asquith have been working for quite a few years now, actually more than 12 years now, is that we need to get rid of those lists. We need to look at vulnerability, borrowing from a universal precautions model, borrowing from public health essentially, and actually consider that everyone is vulnerable until proven otherwise, essentially. This basically means that you bring to the fore the possibility of receiving an awful lot of support services until you realize that the person actually can make their way in the policing process, understand what's happening to them, and understand the idea of getting into the criminal justice system with some particular services offered to them. The universal precautions model that we're advocating for is layered, so it understands that you can have multiple vulnerabilities. You can be homeless and mentally ill and a drug addict and an 84 Aboriginal men suffering from schizophrenia, all those kinds of things, and it advocates for a trauma-informed approach to vulnerability. Now, we've been talking about that model for quite a few years now, and there is some, it would be remiss of me to not mention the fact that there's been huge progress in redefining vulnerability and in trying to get out of that tick in the box approach that we've been having, particularly in Australia, for the past 50 or 60 years. In Australia, we used to have across states and territories legislation that would actually allow police officers to consider either 5 very prescribed forms of vulnerability solely for offenders, not for victims at all, and not for bystanders, all the way down to maybe 21, and with Queensland as the pinnacle of vulnerability policy for policing, which actually started talking about attributes that are a lot more based on an individual person-centered approach and assessment of the situation. I also want to acknowledge that in the past 5 years, there's been huge progress in redefining vulnerability. Some of those efforts in redefining vulnerability have been driven by police officers themselves. Some of those efforts have come from the UK. Thank you so much for kicking that off. I do like the definition of the College of Policing, which is a lot more encompassing than it used to be. And Nicole and I have also tried to adapt a new definition to an Australian and an international context around what vulnerability means, but also what it means according to that definition to be a vulnerable person. And I'm quite lucky to be working with what I will call the Vulnerability Scholarship Extended Family, with colleagues like Scott Key from the UK, but also Emma Williams from Open University, and Jenny, of course, as well, Jenny Norman, but also a significant number of colleagues from Scotland with the Scottish Institute of Policing Research and the Scotland Law Enforcement and Public Health Centre at Napier University and Abertay University. And what we're all noticing here is that we're all advertising for a more ground-up approach of defining vulnerability. That definition needs to come from the person and the person who lives that vulnerability on a daily basis, as either practitioners, but also as victims and offenders and bystanders. So, and we see that that ground up approach actually tends to direct us towards that maximalist approach that we see in those brand new definitions that we've had for the past 3 years. So again, it's that kind of idea that you're vulnerable until you're proven slightly resilient or proven that you don't need the kinds of services that that we initially thought you might need. So what I'm interested in, now that we've got the definitions out of the way, what I want to reflect on really is how that discourse around vulnerability, as far as I can see, has completely failed the policing profession. So when you think about this, and I've tried to put the police office and the public next to each other on the slide here, the definitions of vulnerability have constantly presented, have always been top down, really bottom up, really ground up until recently, as I was saying before. And we've always labeled the police officer as resilient, and I think that's been a mistake. And the public has always been labeled vulnerable. The police officer has rarely been labeled vulnerable, and always labeled resilient. As we can see here, so if we define the public as weak and not resilient, and the police officers as resilient and not vulnerable, we've got a complete schism, and I think that's a word that Scott Key uses a lot in his work. We've got a schism in how we perceive police officers and the public in terms of their vulnerability. I think that some of it is due to the fact that we constantly define the police officer as per their role. And we always define the public in terms of social identity and in terms of social determinants of health. We have very rarely defined police officers in terms of who they are. And it's quite heartbreaking to see police officers struggle in the field and basically talk to an offender or a victim saying, you know, I'm like you, I'm normal, I'm a normal person. But literally, all of you police officers who are here today listening to me talk, are you really? That's not really what the psyche of the police officer presents, right? Are you really normal people? Well, we know you are, but that's not how people perceive you. That's also not how you've been built to be as police officers. You've gone, let's dissect that a little bit. You've gone through absolutely strenuous recruitment, which has basically hammered in your head that you were the cream of the cream and that you were recruited because you had the kinds of attributes that we wanted in a resilient, indestructible police officer who's able to look at crime and solve crime and make the public safer. You have gone through absolutely rigorous training in law enforcement, and you've got heightened skills in protecting the public, in using force, in managing the law, and in managing all of the things that essentially put criminals in prison. You essentially were built to become law enforcers. And the question that I've got for you here is that we have built those historical stereotypes about what you do to such an extent that people have forgotten who you are. And in the social representations of who the police officers are, we had lost this idea that police officers are fundamentally deep inside just like us and actually quite vulnerable. If we adopt a universal definition of vulnerability that says that basically everyone is likely to be injured, everyone is likely to be hurt, either because of situational vulnerability or because of iatrogenic vulnerability, so basically that's how the system hurts you in the process. Well, we have to acknowledge that our first responders are also quite vulnerable, as opposed to that image of resilience that we've been having. So because police officers and our first responders have been built in our social psyche as warriors who combat crime, we've basically constructed structurally and culturally law enforcers who all of a sudden are not vulnerable at all, at least not in how we perceive them. And I think that there are grave consequences of this. There are grave consequences of this in terms of where we are at now, in recognizing that actually no, police officers are not fine at all, and we actually need to start putting police mental health front and center of the profession. We have absolutely horrendous health and well-being statistics here in Australia, and this is not new. We've had those statistics for the past 21 years, so we can't say that we never knew about the topic. We know that suicides are 2 to 3 times as high as what they are in the general population amongst our first responders professions. Twice as high when you look at the whole of first responders professions, and 3 times as high in the policing and emergency services professions. Between 2000 and 2012, we had 126 police suicides in Australia, just in Australia. For us, we are a relatively small population compared to Europe and compared to other parts of the world. That's essentially 1 police suicide every 2 months over 12 years, with very little services offered to police officers in relation to what's happening to them. So I think we're doing a disservice to police officers because we have built this idea and the discourse around the resilience of police officers, that there's been an absolute failure of the system in getting police officers to know and recognizing that the professionalization of policing, and that the profession of policing, that's what I mean rather than professionalization, sorry, it's a bit late, is slowly chipping at that resilience every single day, every single shift, and actually every single job that police officers are called at. So I want to talk about how that has impacted the adaptability, or how that has consequences on the adaptability of policing. We have shown that the resilience of police officers, or we have seen that that the resilience of police officers was really hard to follow through during COVID-19. And of course, the situation in Australia is not as bad. And I know that we're quite lucky here in Australia compared to other parts of the world in terms of COVID-19. But the fact that we've built the profession of policing around law enforcement, but the demands of police, which are meant for them to be absolute problem solvers in any kind of public health matters, are setting some really true questions around how we define police officers and the job that they're doing. I think that police officers are completely victim of their own success. We play a game. I'm very lucky to teach Tasmania police recruits on that matter, and we play a game in class, and I give them this extraordinary problem, and I ask them who you're going to call. And of course, some of them respond Ghostbusters, but eventually they realize that the first people that people are going to call are police officers, because they don't know who else to call. And so we've seen that.
Could you
yes.
try and conclude in a couple of minutes? Would that be okay?
Yes, I will. I've only got another slide to go through, and I'll be done. I really think that we saw that police officers were completely thrown out of their game during COVID-19. They were not asked to enforce criminal legislation. They were asked to enforce public health legislation, which was a very different kind of discourse and a very different kind of demand on them. And we have to question the request for defunding the police. And my question here is, at what cost are we going to ask to defund the police? Are we going to duplicate measures of austerity that have completely depleted membership, and I think completely torpedoed police morale as well? And are we going to fundamentally ask police to see themselves as public health interventionists? So is there a way forward in there? I think there is. And I think that police educators have a role to play in this, in actually telling people that police officers are, of course, law enforcers, but that they're also public health facilitators on a large spectrum of public health and law enforcement and public health. We need to make room in our policing curriculum to teach and discuss issues of resilience and vulnerability honestly. And to paraphrase Sir Marmot, I would like to say that if we want to ensure, if we assure the mental health of police officers at recruit level, basically we will make better police officers. And I don't mean that we need to increase their awareness about mental health. I think they know that, but we need to start getting them to embed good mental health technique and coping mechanisms as part of their daily routine from the point of recruitment into their career. If we want to be able to anticipate, respond, and adapt to change, I think we need to increase the resilience of police officers from the moment that they enter a police academy or police organization. I want to put, as a final note, Commissioner Andrew Colvin, who is the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, in this presentation. He basically is on the record for saying that the resilience of police officers is being slowly chipped at for the very reason that they are the ones who run towards problems when others run away. And I think he's completely correct in saying this, but he's also on the record for saying that the AFP has been ignorant to the impact and the importance of mental health and injury amongst the law enforcement community, but that it has come to realize that first responders cannot look after others if they cannot look after themselves. And I think that's so important for us to acknowledge that vulnerability and that false discourse of police officers as resilient in today's circumstances.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Isabelle, what two subjects that would have warranted two different presentations, but cleverly woven together. There's a question